Right. So in ancient Egypt, so they had some interesting ideas about the nature of the brain, and some of this data has come through this papyrus called Edwin Smith papyrus, I guess named after the discoverer. This is from 1700 BC. So in Egyptian culture, ancient Egyptian culture, the heart is considered the seat of the soul, so as the most important organ, whereas brain is not that important. So they used to scoop out the brain through the nostrils. So the thing is, you can approach the brain through some of these orifices in the head, right? One of them. So even in surgeons, sometimes they can approach the brain through the nose or even through the open mouth, to the kind of a back of the mouth. Instead of making a hole through the head, if you especially want to access the base of the brain, that's a much more elegant way of doing it. So they would scoop out the brain through the nostrils by piercing this bone called the cribriform plate, which is I guess the thinnest bone in the body. So and similarly, if you go to ancient Greece, there were a lot of dichotomy of ideas, a lot of controversy about ideas about the brain. So some philosophers, Greek philosophers, said that brain is the seat of the soul, but that was not definitely not the most popular idea. So, for example, Aristotle, one of the most famous Greek philosophers that we have heard of, especially the trio, the three philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Aristotle was the last among them. So he has speculated extensively about a lot of physical phenomena, and unfortunately, most of the speculations are wrong by modern scientific standards. So he also believed that heart is the seat of the soul and not the brain. And the so, for example, Aristotle's other speculations, which turned out to be wrong, right, is that he thought that heavy objects fall faster than lighter objects, which was wrong. And as you know, for that, this is what Galileo had famously debunked in his theatrical experiment that he performed by going on top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Right, he dropped two stones and he's shown that both stones, one heavy and one light, both stones fall at the same time to the ground. Then Galen, again one of the ancient physicians, European physicians, right? He had extensive knowledge of neuroanatomy. So there's written a book called On the Brain. So in this in this book, he talks about the a wide variety of animal brains, and he even describes how to dissect them, how to identify various parts of the animal brains, and he has written extensive anatomical descriptions or texts about these brains. For example, here is a kind of a picture that illustrates the procedure of performing surgery on an ox and opening its brain. So the description goes something like this: when the part, that is the brain, is suitably prepared, you see the dura mater, which is a kind of a superficial layer on top of the brain, and then slice straight cuts on both sides of the midline down to the ventricles. So he knew that there are these cavities called ventricles in the brain, and so cut to the midline and you will see the ventricles. And you'll observe a third ventricle between the two anterior ventricles with a fourth behind it. So they had the knowledge of all the four ventricles. There are four cavities called ventricles in the brain, and he had knowledge of all the four and a lot more. So the book describes a lot of details about various animal brains. Then a lot of knowledge also has come from Arab scholars, right? Arab surgeons and Arab scientists. For example, Al-Zahrawi, that was a famous Arab surgeon from the 10th century AD. Right? Because this was a time when Europe was in dark ages and somebody had to keep the lamps burning and keep the quest for knowledge going on. So the Arab world had played that role during that period when Europe was in dark ages. And later on, it is through the Arab world, so people have borrowed literature extensively from the Byzantine Empire and from the Middle East. Europeans have borrowed knowledge by translating them and transcribing them and so on. And that was what has supposed to have triggered the Renaissance, European Renaissance in the middle of the last millennium. So Al-Zahrawi was a famous Arab surgeon, and he would perform different kinds of surgeries, treat skull fractures, and even spinal surgeries, in those times. Then if you come to Renaissance, which is supposed to have occurred somewhere between 1400 to about 1600, okay, there's about 2 or 3 centuries, around that time, around 1500s. So there was a lot of progress, a lot of revolutionary thinking and analysis and research in many different areas, culture and science and construction, architecture, and so on. So Leonardo da Vinci, we all know him as a great artist, the famous artist of Mona Lisa painting. But he's also done extensive scientific studies, including even in engineering and botany, physics. He has done a lot of work in optics, mechanics, flow of fluids and things like that. He was also interested in biology and has done extensive studies in biology. And one of those these studies include anatomical studies of the brain. And to perform these studies, he would actually buy dead bodies of of criminals who were executed, right? And then after the execution, he would just buy the dead bodies, bring the dead bodies stealthily to his studio because there was some kind of a religious injunction against dissection of human dead bodies. So he can be in trouble for doing that, but he would stealthily buy them, bribe off people and get these bodies and dissect them and study various body parts. And his analysis that he performed of brain and brain anatomy were quite classic. And since he's also an artist, he has drawn extensive, very detailed pictures of various brain regions. Then we come to the French philosopher René Descartes, who we all know as the person who developed the coordinate geometry, or what we call the Cartesian geometry, right, which performs a marriage of algebra and geometry, right? And one of the great contributions of Descartes, right, to modern science itself, is the way he dealt with the problem of God. I'm saying problem of God because God is celebrated in religion. I mean, everybody loves God and they worship and adore and all that. But in science, it can be a bit of a problem because, especially if you look at the medieval period, European medieval period, the way people were giving explanations to physical phenomena is a bit strange because the explanations were very constantly colored by religious beliefs. So, for example, if you ask why are the planets round, the explanation would be a sphere is a perfect geometrical object and God likes perfection. So, therefore, planets are round, right? Or why are planetary orbits circular? First of all, they're not circular, but I mean, look at primitive data, they might seem like circular. Why are planetary orbits circular? Because circle is a perfect shape, and God loves perfection. God created this universe which is all perfect, especially heavens. There could be imperfections on the ground on this earth, because earth is a lowly thing, and whereas heavens are always perfect and they are divine. So the planetary orbits are perfect. That's why later on when Galileo found that the moon is actually full of huge holes, it's not perfect at all. It's not a perfect sphere at all, and people were quite shocked because that cannot be, because in God's creation everything is perfect and whole, right? So that was very blasphemous. So Descartes saw this problem and said, he wanted to put an end to this whole confusion. So he said, yes, there are two worlds, right? There is this world of God and mind, and then there's a physical world, right? And so the mind and matter, they're totally different, very different nature, and they have their own laws, right? And so you have to study matter independently and mind independently. So that way he cut off this whole. And similarly, when it comes to God, he said, yes, God created the world, perhaps. So we agree with you, the religious guys. But once he has created the world, he has left it alone and he kind of stepped back. He doesn't want to tinker with it or tamper with it anymore, right? So once it is created, the world simply runs like a machine based on some physical laws, right? So all that we have to do is now to understand the world and to understand the laws. That's all. You don't have to worry about what God is thinking about it all the time. So with this kind of Alexander, like cutting the Gordian knot, right? He just separated this problem of God from the physical inquiry, and that liberated science from religious kind of underpinnings. And it is this kind of approaches that have led to the scientific revolution. So let us now look at how people have studied brain from a more scientific standpoint. So without any kind of influence of religious ideas. So one of the earliest studies of the brain. So in terms of gross anatomy, people had that understanding for millennia, right? And for thousands of years, people understood that brain has two hemispheres, and there are these kind of convolutions on the surface, and then there are these lobes and ventricles, all that stuff, and there are these nerves sticking out of the brain. All that people knew for thousands of years. But when it comes to microanatomy, what is brain like? You look at it closely at microscopic level. That knowledge came very recently, a few centuries ago. Because for that you need a microscope. And Robert Hooke, with his primitive microscope, has done observations of brain tissue, and he saw these small cells, but he thought they were all connected. That is, all the cells form a continuum. In the sense, if you look at this cartoon picture of some cells which have wires sticking over. So the thing is, it is like there is a continuous corridor going from one side to another. So the inside of the cell is called the cytoplasm. It is a fluid-filled medium. So this picture indicates that there is a continuous pathway which you can follow and go from one cell to another cell. It's like in some college campuses, you have corridors which connect one building to another. So you can, without going out into the sun, you can go from one building to another simply by going through these corridors. The way, for example, in the CLT building is connected to the math department and so on. Just an analogy. Now, so therefore, they thought that neurons are special. They're all connected, and they form what is called a syncytium. The cells form an integral whole, and they form a network, which is called a syncytium. And such an idea was necessary because one of the strange things that Descartes has said is that his commentary on how reflex action works. So suppose you stick your finger in a fire, then immediately you feel the pain and withdraw the hand in a shock, right? So when you do that, apparently, according to Descartes, right, the signal goes from the fire, from the finger which has touched the fire, to the brain, and he calls this the central endings, right? He says it goes to this organ called pineal gland, and from there, certain animal spirits rush through these pipes called the nerves, and quickly that will help the hand withdraw, right, or move back from the fire. So he was thinking about these things called animal spirits, which flow along the nerve fibers, because people could see nerve fibers for a long time, nerve bundles for a long time, but they couldn't understand exactly how does the nervous action take place, because they didn't have no notion of electricity until very recently. So that's the kind of explanation that people were giving about nervous action. So for that to happen, something has to flow through the nerves, right, from the brain to the nerve. Something has to flow, some kind of fluid. So for a fluid to flow, then obviously the cells have to be connected. There should be a continuous passage from neurons in the brain to the nerves out there in the hand. So all these ideas, they wanted to connect them together and assume that the cells form a syncytium. Right. So later on, Camillo Golgi, right, and this is much recently, like just last century. So he's developed this staining technique. So the thing is, neurons are almost transparent, so you cannot really see their boundaries. We just look at them in unstained fashion. But with a stain, you can see neurons get colored, right, and you can easily see the outlines of the cell body and all the fibers sticking out of the cell. The picture on the right is a slice of hippocampus. This was from a Golgi stained hippocampus, and you can see those black dots, which are the neuron cell bodies. What is interesting is this picture is not a micrograph; it is a hand-drawn picture, so beautifully drawn and so painstakingly by observing the slice in a microscope. So then Raymond E. Cajal, who is called the father of modern neuroscience, right? He also used Golgi's technique and did extensive observations of neurons in microscopic observations. And he kind of proposed that the neurons don't form a syncytium, they don't form a continuous network. There is a clear gap from one neuron to another. So neuron is an isolated entity. Doesn't form a continuum. And he said there is a little gap between two neurons, and neuron is a fundamental unit of the brain. That's the basic functional unit of the brain. And this kind of a teaching is called the neuron doctrine, right? And he was awarded the Nobel Prize for proposing this neuron doctrine. But only thing is, at the time of Ramon y Cajal, they couldn't have seen this tiny gap that exists between two neurons, because when two neurons come into contact, that contact is a very small region, and you need really a very modern microscopes to see that, because it's only about 40 microns, sorry, 40 nanometers. Okay, so you can see this in this electron micrograph, or a micro, right? You can see that the two parallel lines that you see, horizontal lines that you see, are roughly the two borders or two membranes of two different neurons. Okay, then so there's a gap between them. So the neurons don't form a continuum. But Cajal obviously didn't have access to those kinds of such microscopes. It was a good guess, and he happened to be right. Okay, so like that, people have understood certain things about the microstructure of the brain. What is it like at level of single cells in the brain? Then let us look at the function. When it comes to neurons' function or signaling, so people had knowledge of anatomy, of gross structure of the brain for thousands of years. But when it comes to function, there was a lot of vagueness, a lot of controversy and debate, disagreement for a long time. And even today, the problem still continues because, like I said, we still don't have a good theory of most brain structures. There are lots of theories, but there's nothing like a unified theory, which is what you have like in any kind of a classical scientific field, which is well matured. So the knowledge of signaling has come with some of the pioneering work done by Luigi Galvani, Italian physiologist and physicist. So this guy was working with muscles of dead animals, and so the effect of electricity on dead animals, because this was the time when people already understood electrostatics. Electrodynamics came a bit later, especially the effects of the currents and moving charges and the EM waves. All that came much later in the late 19th century. But electrostatics people knew for several centuries before that. And so what this guy was doing is he was charging up some material and then putting those rods in contact with a frog's legs, which was extracted from a frog's body. Once, when one of his assistants did that accidentally, he saw that the leg twitched. Because although the animal was dead, there is still some kind of juice left in the leg. When he touched the leg, the exposed frog's muzzle of the frog's leg with this charged rod, the leg twitched as if it is alive. It's still alive. So, so then they understood that there is something. The frogs or animals' muscular activity has something to do with electricity, or what we understand as electricity. So until then, people thought that whatever happens inside the biological system is totally different from what happens in a physical system outside biology. But once they did this demonstration, they could see that there's something common between the two. The electricity that you see in a charged rod and the twitching of the frog's muzzle, there is something common to them. It is this electricity that is producing the twitch in the frog's muzzle. It's not a different kind of. There's nothing like an animal electricity, which is what people used to think in the early times. So that laid the foundations of what is called electrophysiology, right? Which is all about the study of electricity in physiological systems or in biological systems. Now, a culmination of that kind of an analysis was what is called electroencephalogram, which came in the early part of 20th century. So in 1924, this German physiologist called Hans Berger, right? He hooked up human subjects with a whole bunch of electrodes, a whole network of electrodes, about 20 of them, at various points on the head. And so he found that just like ECG picks up the heart's electrical activity, these electrodes placed on the head, on the scalp of the head, pick up the electrical activity of the brain. And this kind of a recording is called electroencephalogram. So about another 25, 30 years later, right, two British biologists, Alan Hodgkin and Andrew Huxley, they wanted to understand how does the brain produce electricity, or exactly how does the neuron produce electricity. So for that, they want to perform experiments to understand the molecular basis of neural electricity. So for that, they got hold of this giant animal called the squid. It's a giant squid. That this is so big that it could even wreck a ship. It would sink a ship, dig big holes into the hull and wreck a ship. You might have seen this kind of animal, of course, an animated version in some of these Pirates of Caribbean movies, which is very well graphically rendered in those movies. So they have taken this giant squid because these creatures have thick nerves. The nerves are about 2 millimeters thick. So you could poke them with electrodes and take recordings. So Hodgson and Huxley took recordings of this kind of a squid axon or squid nerve fiber, which is very thick, and discovered that when the nerve fiber gets stimulated, it produces an electrical signal, right? A very sharp electrical signal, which looks like a voltage spike, which is here in this graph. So the signal, so once it is stimulated, it just quickly rises to a peak and quickly falls again. And so the different parts of this waveform is called an action potential. Different parts of it were given different names. For example, in normal resting conditions, the axon is in a depolarized state. That is, the voltage inside is negative with respect to the ground, which is outside. But once the nerve fiber is stimulated, this negative becomes positive, and the membrane of the axon becomes what is called depolarized. The polarity switches, right? And that only remains very brief for a brief moment, like about a millisecond, and after that the voltage quickly drops and comes back to the negative value inside the axon. Okay, so the rise is called the depolarization, the fall is called the repolarization, and sometimes when it falls, it goes to a value which is less than its resting value. Therefore, then it is called, that part is called the hyperpolarization. Okay, so like that, people have understood something about how a neuron works. So then the next question is, how do two neurons talk to each other? What is that signal that goes from one neuron to another? Because after the neuron doctrine and after a lot of subsequent studies, people have understood that neurons are kind of unconnected, that they form kind of isolated entities. So something must be going from one neuron to another so that the neurons can talk to each other. What is that something? Now, people knew for a long time that chemicals will have action on the nervous system. So, for example, hunters were using certain neurotoxins. Now we know that a lot of these toxins have a chemical called muscarine, which inhibits certain receptors on muscles, on skeletal muscle. So these toxins, when they would dip their darts in this toxin and shoot them with blowpipes. When the dart hits the animal's leg or something, it acts on the muscle and paralyzes the muscle. Muscle stops contracting, and the animal cannot run, and they can catch the animal. So, so that means the chemical that is a poison. The chemical of the poison is acting on the muscle and having some effect on the cell of the muscle. Right. So these kinds of data, and also very simple example of chemical acting on the brain is alcohol. Right. When people have a drink, an alcoholic drink, then you feel drowsy and so on. So obviously that is an example of some kind of a material food acting on your brain. But there's an interesting joke about this in the life of C.V. Raman. So once Raman was at a big party and somebody offered him some alcohol, like a wine or something. He joked saying that, I would like to study Raman's effect in alcohol, but not effect of alcohol on Raman. Where there's just a joke that happened in his life. So these kinds of studies on effect of chemicals on cells, right, were taken seriously by Paul Ehrlich and several others. He said if chemicals are able to act on the cell, perhaps there are certain molecules on the cell, right, which can receive the action of these chemicals, which can decode, right, and maybe bind with these chemicals and decode that chemical and have very specific action on the cell. If that is the case, why are there such molecules on the cell all the time? Obviously, these molecules are not waiting for some hunter to shoot at the animal or for somebody to take alcohol or anything. These molecules on the cell must be in the normal conditions, right? Serving to enable cell-to-cell communication. So normally cells must be talking with the help of these molecules. It's not just they're not responding to inputs coming from outside only. So if that is the case, then if cells have molecules on them which can decode the effect of chemicals coming from outside, then why can't we think of killing, right, harmful cells like harmful microorganisms by designing chemicals which can specifically act on those harmful microorganisms? He called such chemicals a magic bullet. And then he said maybe all diseases can be cured if only we could figure out what is a magic bullet for a given germ. Because the germ theory of disease was popular for a long time, right? Even now in the COVID times, we knew how much we suffered it because of one little germ, one little virus. So the thinking is that if you can somehow fix that germ, then you can fix the disease. So John Langley also talked about this receptor substances. Now we know that cells have these receptors and receptor binds with ligands and all that. But at that time it was only a guess, and they thought that drug molecule binds with the receptor and has an effect on the cell. So the question of what is released by a neuron and using which the one neuron talks to another neuron. What is this chemical reaction on the neuron? This was a mystery for a long time. So to prove chemical action of a neuron on a cell was a big challenge. And this guy called Otto Loewi, right, took up this challenge. He was thinking about a proper experiment by which you can show that a chemical can act on a cell or an organ. And apparently the story goes like this. He had in months when he was working in the lab, he just dozed off. He had a dream about the right kind of experimental setup which can demonstrate this property. Then he got up in the next day and kind of vaguely remembered a dream that he had about certain experiment, but he didn't remember the details, and he felt bad that he didn't get up immediately and note down all the details. Because generally when you get the dream, immediately you'll remember it, but after some time you'll forget it. So next night, apparently he got the same dream, and this time he had a notebook next to his bed, and he got up and immediately noted down the entire experimental setup as he saw in the dream. And later on, he has performed the experiment, which is actually a very simple experiment. It goes like this. So you can actually preserve a heart and keep it beating in what is called a Ringer solution. You need to keep the bath, maintain the bath with certain nutrients so that will keep the heart beating for some time. So now the heart, this was, I'm not sure which heart it is. I think it's a rabbit's heart, but I need to check it once. So this heart, you can make a preparation of the heart in such a way that the nerve attached to the heart is also kept intact. So the nerve one of the nerves that controls the heart is called the vagus nerve. So if you activate this nerve, electrically activate this nerve, its effect on the heart is to slow it down. So they have taken two hearts into Ringer solutions, and one of the hearts, the first heart, right, is attached to the vagus nerve. So they simulated the vagus nerve and observed that the first heart slows down. Then they have taken this liquid from the bath of the first heart and injected that liquid to the bath of the second heart, right? And when they did that, the second heart slowed down, which is very interesting because normally you would think that you need the vagus nerve connection to slow down the heart, but only the first heart had the vagus nerve, second heart just didn't have. But all that was carried over from first heart to second heart is the liquid on the bath, right, in the bath. So therefore, the only conclusion you can draw from this is that when the vagus nerve was stimulated, it must have released some kind of a chemical which has acted on the heart. And not only that, it must have got leaked into the surrounding medium, the fluid. Therefore, when you carried some fluid from the surrounding medium and over to the second heart also slowed down. So it was such an elegant demonstration that neural action happens by chemical transmission, and which was proved to be true much later, using more detailed experiments later, right? And actually, Otto Loewi shared, the Nobel Prize for this slick experiment, which doesn't even take maybe $100 to perform, right? And he shared with a couple of others for this work. So then, our understanding of brain function came in a different way, which also came quite dramatically, because the earliest attempts even in this area were quite crude. One of the first attempts about how function is distributed in the brain, right, came through a certain pseudoscientific field called phrenology. Phrenos is mind and ology is study. So it's kind of study of the brain or mind. So the argument of these guys would go something like this. So they would teach that different functions of or characteristic of a person are located in different parts of the brain. And if a given characteristic is very prominent in a given person, the corresponding brain area will be therefore also prominent and will be extraordinarily large. So for example, suppose there is a certain brain area for generosity. It is observed there is no such brain area. But assuming, if you believe these guys and assume that there is an area for generosity, and if a person is very generous, the generosity area in the brain will be very large. This is what the phrenologists would like to believe. And not only that, this large part of the brain will start pushing outwards or upwards, right, from inside into the skull. And because of that kind of a pressure exerted by the brain on the skull also gets swollen. The corresponding area in the skull gets swollen. So therefore, if just by looking at the surface of the head, by looking at the bumps on the head, you could make out a person's character. This is what the phrenologists would teach. And just like things like the pseudoscientific topics like palmistry, right? They would feel a person's surface of the head and say something about the person's character, which is quite absurd. But they were quite popular, and they were also making a lot of money with this kind of pseudoscientific activities. So Napoleon, the French emperor, right, who has heard about all this and was really upset with all this, because he was a strong supporter of science, right? He said, somebody should clean up this whole problem and put this whole thing on a scientific footing. How is function distributed in the brain? So then he called one of the court, resident doctors, and he asked him to study it more systematically. So that guy was Jean-Pierre Flourens, and what Flourens has done is taken experimental animals, made cuts through the heads, the brains of these animals, and observed their behavior. What he wanted to see is, depending upon the location of the cut, the precise location of the cut, you see a precise change in the behavior. And he didn't see any such specificity between the location of the cut and the change in the behavior. So he said, no, there is no such localization of the function in the brain, and all functions are performed by the entire brain, right? There's no precise mapping. So actually that is not quite true. But Flourens concluded that way because the cuts he made in the brain were pretty large. They were not like surgical cuts, So that's how he concluded that. But later on, British neurologist Hugh Glynn-Jackson, right, did studies on seizure patients, that is, patients who suffer from epileptic fits, right? So these people, that suddenly they lose consciousness and they start shaking, they lose balance, they fall off, and all these things. You might have seen people who are experiencing convulsions. So in certain kind of seizures, what are now called Jacksonian seizures, the patient, the tremor starts from usually one extremity, like the fingers of the hand, for example. And so initially fingers start shaking, and then the wrist starts shaking, then the elbow starts shaking, the shoulder, and it spreads to the entire body, and the person loses balance and falls off. When he saw this pattern of spreading of the seizure in the body, he had a very nice insight. That he said probably in the brain, different parts of the body are controlled by different parts of the brain. Maybe fingers from one region, wrist from a different region in the brain, and the elbow from a different region, shoulder from a different region, and so on. Not only that, regions which control nearby parts of the body in the brain are also themselves close to each other in the brain. That means there will be some kind of a map of the body in the brain. And why is that so? Why did you think that way? Because if there is an abnormal activity in one part of the brain, and if that is simply spreading the way a fire spreads in a forest, if that is simply spreading from that region to the neighboring region, this is a kind of a behavior that you would see, right? If the abnormal activity starts in the finger area in the brain, that will spread to the neighboring area, which happens to be the wrist area, and that will spread to the neighboring area in the brain, which happens to be the elbow area, and so on and so forth. And it was a beautiful insight, and he was really quite right in his insight. And later on, people have worked out these maps, that is brain maps, right, where there is a mapping between the maps in the brain and the body. So this kind of brain mapping studies, earlier studies were performed by a Canadian neurosurgeon, Wilder Penfield, right? What he has done is he would actually expose the brains of patients and electrically stimulate them. So he would pass electricity right into the brain and stimulate them and see what happens. What does the patient experience? And why was he doing this experiment? I mean, not just out of scientific curiosity, but because that's not that easy to just access a patient and cut the brain just out of sheer curiosity. He was performing surgeries as a treatment for epilepsy. Because in epilepsy, there is this kind of uncontrolled activity of the brain, and often it starts from temporal lobe somewhere. And so you need to identify the precise location of that source, and then you kill it off. You remove the tissue and kill off that, what is called the epileptic focus. So the thing is, epileptic focus will look like normal tissue. That region will look like normal tissue. It is different only functionally. In appearance, it looks the same as neighboring tissue. So the only way to isolate it is by electrical stimulation. If electrical stimulated, if it is a focus, then suddenly the brain will go into seizure. If it's a different area, that won't happen. So he would actually probe the entire brain surface point by point with the electrode and then see where the focus is. In the process, he would also observe what the patient is experiencing and map the brain areas. So, for example, when he was stimulating the occipital lobe, the part of the brain in the back, the patient would report that he is seeing flashes of light. So, there's no real light, just electrical stimulation of the brain. The visual areas of the brain will produce visual experience. So, similarly, if you stimulate the auditory areas of the brain, the patients report that they're hearing sounds, they're hearing some songs that they've heard long ago and things like that. Or sometimes they would even say that somebody is talking in the room. But they also know that there's nobody else, nobody's talking, but they could hear voices in the room. That's because their auditory cortex is electrically activated. So which sounds very almost spooky. But I mean, basically what it says is our experiences are created by the electrical activity of the brain. We don't even need something real out there in the world to produce experience. Okay, so these philosophical questions aside, which will return to these questions towards the end of the course. But with the help of such studies, he had produced some very elegant brain maps. So this gave a kind of simplistic picture that there is some kind of a detailed map of the entire body, and so brain is like there is a little human being, that little operator sitting in the brain controlling the entire body. And they call this kind of a fictional operator the homunculus. Homunculus means a little man, little homo, right, and so on. So those kinds of ideas were proceeding in some direction. Now, then there's this French neurologist called Paul Broca, who studied a set of patients who have interesting kind of speech problems. So Broca's patients could utter only one word. That word is tan, right? Or they could say tan, or even tan, but they could only say that one word, tan. And after their death, when Broca studied these patients' brains, he found that there was damage in this particular area, which is sort of shown in orange. That's called the Broca's area. Similarly, another Austrian physician called Karl Wernicke has discovered another area where damage to this area will give rise to something called Wernicke's aphasia. So these people, so in Broca's case, they were not able to say much. They could not produce complete sentences. At the best, they could utter single words. In Wernicke's area, in Wernicke's patients, they could utter sentences, but the sentences don't make much sense. They have no meaning. Look at this sentence from Wernicke's patient. I called my mother on the television and did not understand the door. It was to breakfast, and then but they came from far to near. My mother is not too old for me to be young. So it's sentences are interesting. They're quite elaborate and all that, but they don't make much sense. This is the kind of output that you see in case of damage to Wernicke's area. Then there is a third kind of aphasia. Aphasia refers to speech problem. The third kind of aphasia where people could not repeat what is said to them. Suppose to these patients, if you say a sentence and ask them to repeat, they'll show evidence that they're essentially understanding what you're saying, but they'll have trouble repeating it. Right? And by themselves, they can say some other sentences, but they cannot repeat what you have told to them. And that is because in this case, the Wernicke's area is fine, the Broca's area is fine. But a bundle of fibers which connect the Wernicke's area to the Broca's area, this bundle is called the arcuate fasciculus. This bundle is damaged. Therefore, there is no conduction from Wernicke's area to the Broca's area. And that kind of an aphasia is called conduction aphasia. Right? So there was this view about which is the correct view, right? Look at people like Jean-Pierre Flourens, who said entire brain, right, controls every function. Okay, so that is called the aggregate field view. Whole brain works as a whole. There is opposite view is no, different parts of the brain perform different functions. That is called the localization view, and people kept on fighting about it. So Wernicke gave some kind of a synthesis of all this. He said that yes, when it comes to very small, minute functions, specific parts of the brain perform those functions. When you look at large-scale functions, many different parts of the brain work together, right, to undertake that function. For example, speech production is done by Broca's area, and speech understanding is done by Wernicke's area. But the entire language comprehension production, if you look at the entire language function, if you take, That is done by a network which combines Broca's area, Wernicke's area, and several other brain areas. So there's a huge network in the brain that performs language functions. So we shouldn't talk about which part of the brain does what. We should talk about which network in the brain does what. That is a more appropriate way of describing things. Okay, so we call this kind of a view of the brain parallel and distributed processing, because in the brain, whenever brain does anything, a lot of brain areas work in parallel and in a distributed fashion, right? And these ideas much later, like in the 80s, because Wernicke's is from 19th century, but in the 80s, a lot of mathematical developments have taken place. These ideas have become quite popular, and that led to what's called a connectionist evolution. We'll talk about that later in the course. Then also a lot of experimental techniques have been developed, and people were able to record from single neurons, even single ion channels. Right? There's a technique called patch clamp, for which the inventors were awarded Nobel Prize, where you could measure currents going in a single ion channel, single molecule, this little pore in the membrane. And now we can also do imaging of the brains and look at brain's activity, brain's connectivity patterns, and a lot of information about brain is now available. You can model brain in great detail, going all the way to single fibers in that connect the neurons. So you can do very detailed models of the brain. Okay, so a lot of tools are available, a lot of data is available. But like I said, what is missing is a kind of integrated view of the brain that explains how exactly different structures in the brain function. Okay, so we'll try to address this question throughout the course. We'll try to understand the principles as deeply as possible and apply these principles to understand the function of various brain systems. So let's just put your thinking caps right, and then let's get ready for an exciting adventure. Okay, thank you. If you have any questions, I can take it. Otherwise, we can meet in the next class.